Empires were built on gold, armies, and porridge. While emperors feasted, the peasants who kept their worlds running scraped by on meals you've probably never imagined. From onion flatbreads to boiled cabbage water, these weren't delicacies, they were survival. Here's what you didn't know. These 15 humble dishes fueled millions and kept imperial life moving, one meager bite at a time. For peasants in northern China, millet was more than a crop. It was survival in its plainest form. It grew in dry, stubborn soil where rice would wither, and it asked for little in return. But the meals it gave were humble. Millet gruel was nothing more than a handful of yellow grains boiled in water until they softened, sometimes with a pinch of salt if the household could spare it. It was thin, pale, and far from filling, but it kept hunger from taking over completely. On bitter winter mornings, the steam rising from the pot was the only warmth in a mud-walled home. Children cupped their hands around the bowls, not to eat right away, but to feel that fleeting heat. Flavor was a rare gift. A few chopped scallions or pickled greens could turn it into a small comfort, but most days it was plain, swallowed in silence before heading to the fields. Every spoonful was a reminder that the work ahead would be harder than the meal behind. Millet gruel did not promise joy. It promised another day, and in other corners of the empire, survival came in the shape of rough breads made from whatever grains the earth would give. In later centuries of Imperial China, when maize made its way from distant lands into the fields of the north, it became a quiet blessing for the poor. Wheat was costly, millet was precious, but corn was plentiful. Peasants learned to grind it into meal, sometimes mixing in millet or soybean flour, and shape it into small, hollow cones called wotu. These were steamed over bubbling pots, their coarse scent filling cramped kitchens. They were dry, heavy, and stuck to the mouth. Without tea or soup, swallowing could feel like forcing down sand. Yet wotu kept people alive when granaries were near empty. They could be made in batches, carried to the fields in a cloth wrap, and eaten cold under the open sky. On lucky days, a smear of bean paste or a strip of pickled greens found its way inside, turning a mouthful of dryness into a rare moment of flavor. There's an old story that an empress once tasted wotu during hard times and brought it into the palace. True or not, for peasants it remained a food of necessity, not luxury. And in the warmer, wetter south, the answer to an empty stomach came in the form of a thin, steaming bowl of rice congee. In the rice-growing provinces of southern China, congee was the meal that stood between a family and hunger. It began with just a handful of rice and a pot of water, boiled until the grains burst and dissolved into a thin, cloudy porridge. The more mouths to feed, the more water went in, stretching that precious rice as far as it could go. Most mornings, it was plain. No meat, no oil, not even salt if the jar was empty. A strip of pickled radish or a spoonful of fermented greens, when available, could turn a bland bowl into something that felt alive. Children slurped it quickly before school or chores, while elders ate slowly, letting the warmth seep through tired bones. Congee wasn't about fullness, it was about endurance. It kept workers on their feet in the fields, even if their stomachs began to ache again by midday. In the rain-soaked south, the sight of steam rising from a battered clay pot was a promise that, for today at least, no one would go to bed with nothing. But farther north and west, where rice was rare and soils were harsher, survival came in the form of dense, coarse cakes made from hardier grains. In the wind-scoured lands of the northwest, wheat was a luxury and rice a distant dream. Here, the earth yielded barley, millet, and whatever hardy grains could cling to the soil. Peasants ground them into a rough flour, sometimes stretching it further with bean meal, and shaped the dough into thick, heavy cakes. These were steamed or cooked over flat stones, the smoke clinging to their crust. They were filling, but not gentle. The texture scratched the mouth, and the taste carried a bitterness that no amount of chewing could hide. Yet to a laborer who had been bending in the fields since dawn, each bite meant another hour of strength. The cakes traveled well, wrapped in cloth and eaten cold under a thin patch of shade. There was no softness to them, They were as unyielding as the land itself. Still, they kept families going through planting and harvest, through windstorms and frost. And when the work was done for the day, some households found a way to bring a little warmth and sharpness to the table with simple flatbreads scented with onions or garlic. In the villages of the north, where a sack of flour was guarded like treasure, peasants learned to make the most of it. A small handful of dough could be rolled thin, brushed with water, and sprinkled with chopped scallions or crushed garlic before being folded and cooked on a hot clay griddle. The sizzle and smell would fill a small courtyard, drawing hungry eyes long before the bread was ready. These flatbreads were quick to make and quicker to eat. They didn't last. By the time they cooled, they were often gone. On days when oil was scarce, the bread was dry and crisp, but the flavor of the scallions or garlic still cut through the monotony of grain-heavy diets. For families used to plain millet or coarse barley, that sharpness was a gift. Children would wait by the hearth, hoping for the first piece, still too hot to hold. Adults, aching from a day in the fields, ate slowly, letting each bite linger. And when the last piece was gone, there was always the comfort of knowing that something just as vital, a jar of pickled mustard greens, was waiting to carry them through the next meal. In the cold months, when gardens lay bare and fields yielded nothing fresh, the survival of a peasant family often depended on what had been salted away in jars. Pickled mustard greens, known as suan kai, were one of the most reliable lifelines. Harvested while still crisp, the leaves were packed into clay vessels with coarse salt and left to ferment, the sharp scent filling storerooms and kitchens alike. They were more than a side dish. They were a safeguard against the long, gnawing hunger of winter. A strip of suan kai alongside a bowl of millet gruel or flatbread brought tang, salt, and life to otherwise plain meals. It was a taste that woke the tongue and, for a brief moment, made the day's labor feel less heavy. Children learned early that the jars were precious, opened only when needed. A misjudged portion could mean going without before spring arrived. Still, when the brine met the lips after weeks of bland food, it felt like a luxury. And when the wind outside turned harsher and colder, another plant, hardy and green even against the frost, was waiting to be lifted from the soil and boiled into a humble, warming soup. Cabbage was the quiet hero of many peasant gardens. It could withstand frost, grow in poor soil, and keep for weeks if stored well. When the cold tightened its grip and fresh harvests were long past, a simple cabbage pulled from the earth could mean the difference between going to bed with something in your stomach or nothing at all. Cabbage soup needed little more than water and a pinch of salt. The leaves softened in the pot, their pale green turning translucent as steam filled the small, smoky room. On rare days, scraps of pork fat, a handful of dried shrimp, or a spoonful of soybeans might find their way in, turning the broth richer and thicker. But even plain, it carried warmth, the kind that worked its way from the hands cupping the bowl to the chest and belly. It wasn't a meal to savor slowly. Hunger made it vanish quickly, the thin broth swallowed as if it might slip away. Yet it was enough to keep a laborer standing through another day in the fields. And in other parts of the empire, strength came not from leafy greens, but from the simple power of grains and beans cooked together in a single pot. In many rural corners of Imperial China, rice alone could never stretch far enough. By midday, it left the stomach hollow again, and there was no room for waste in a peasant household. Mixing rice with beans, mung, soy, or adzuki was the answer. Together, they made a meal that lasted longer, filled the belly more deeply, and gave both the energy of rice and the strength of beans. It was a dish of practicality. Beans could be stored for months in woven baskets, safe from damp, while rice came in small sacks from local paddies or nearby trade. In the pot, they simmered together until the grains softened and the beans began to break apart, their earthy flavor seeping into the rice. A little salt, if you had it, brought the two into harmony. Families often cooked enough to last more than one meal, reheating the pot over a low fire the next morning. Each serving was modest, but it kept the aches of hunger at bay. And when even beans were scarce, peasants turned to another source of strength: a humble, protein-rich seed that had been part of their fields for thousands of years. For countless generations, soybeans were the quiet foundation of peasant diets. They grew where other crops failed, stored well through every season, and offered a rare gift in a world where protein was scarce. When the jars of beans were opened, they were boiled slowly in a clay pot until soft, their skins wrinkling, the air filling with a nutty, earthy scent. Sometimes they were eaten whole, scooped straight from the pot. Other times they were mashed into a thick paste, seasoned with nothing more than a little salt or a splash of fermented bean sauce if the family was lucky. The taste was simple, almost plain, but it filled the belly and steadied the body for long hours in the fields. It wasn't a food of celebration, it was a food of work, a food of necessity. Children learned early how to chew each bite slowly, making it last, knowing the pot might not be full again tomorrow. But when the weather turned cold and the days grew short, there was another comfort waiting, a pot of legumes simmered into a warm, hearty soup that could feed the entire household for days. When the cold set in and the wind pressed against the thin walls of a peasant home, the answer was often a pot of peas or beans left to simmer over the fire. Dried mung beans, adzuki beans, or field peas could sit in storage for months, waiting for the time when fresh harvests were gone. Once dropped into boiling water, they swelled and softened, turning the broth cloudy and rich. On good days, a few cloves of garlic or a pinch of dried chili gave the soup more bite. On most days, it was only the beans, the water, and the salt, if salt could be spared. The soup thickened with each reheating, clinging to the spoon, giving the kind of warmth that started in the hands and spread slowly to tired shoulders. It was not just a single meal. A large pot could last for 2 or 3 days, reheated morning and night, each serving a little thicker, a little heartier. And when the fields offered their bright orange harvest, peasants had another way to fill their bowls with something sweet and sustaining. When autumn came and the fields turned gold, peasants in many parts of China looked to a crop that asked for little and gave in abundance: pumpkin and winter squash. These hardy plants thrived in poor soil and stored well through the long, cold months. A single gourd could feed a family for days, its thick flesh keeping hunger at bay when other supplies ran low. Cooking was simple. The pumpkin was cut open, the seeds saved for the next planting, and the flesh boiled or steamed until soft. Mashed in a wooden bowl, it was bright in color and naturally sweet, a welcome change from the bitter grains and salty pickles that filled most days. On rare occasions, a drizzle of oil, a pinch of salt, or a bit of honey would be added, turning it into something almost indulgent. But even plain, it brought a warmth that spread through the body. Children often licked the bowl clean, knowing there might not be more until the next harvest. And for families living near the empire's borders, another rare source of nourishment came not from the fields, but from the milk of their own animals. In the far reaches of the empire, along the grasslands of Inner Mongolia and the highlands of Tibet, life was different from the rice paddies and millet fields of the heartland. Here, herding was as essential as farming, and milk from cows, goats, or yaks became a rare treasure in the peasant diet. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so families turned it into curds or lightly fermented drinks that could last longer. The process was simple but precious. Milk was left to sour naturally or mixed with a small amount from a previous batch to start the fermentation. Once thickened, it was strained, leaving soft, tangy curds rich in protein, a rare gift for bodies worn down by work and cold. These curds could be eaten fresh with coarse bread, salted to keep longer, or even dried into hard pieces for storage. Every drop mattered. A single goat's yield was divided between children, cooking and preserving. On days when curds were served, the meal felt fuller, the work ahead a little less heavy. And for those living near rivers and lakes, the next source of sustenance often came from the water itself, swimming right into their nets and baskets. In villages near rivers, lakes, or the southern rice paddies, the water was as much a provider as the soil. Peasants cast nets for small fish that wealthier households ignored and collected river snails from the muddy banks. These catches were humble, bony, and sometimes bitter, but they brought much-needed protein to meals built mostly on grains and vegetables. Cooking was done in the simplest way. Fish were simmered whole, heads and all, in a pot of boiling water with a few slices of ginger or garlic if they were available. River snails were cleaned, then added to the broth, their flavor seeping into the liquid. Sometimes leafy greens or pickled vegetables found their way into the pot, making the stew a little more hearty. The taste was never extravagant, but it carried the freshness of the water and the quiet satisfaction of a day's catch. A bowl of steaming stew could take the edge off an empty stomach and warm, cold fingers. And when the rivers ran low or the catch was poor, families turned once again to the land, gathering what little it still had to give in the form of wild, foraged greens. When the fields were bare and the stores nearly empty, peasants turned to the wild for survival. Hillsides, ditches, and the edges of paths offered hardy plants like shepherd's purse, wild amaranth, and dandelion greens. These wild vegetables cost nothing but the time and effort to collect, yet they brought vitamins and variety to diets that would otherwise be nothing but grain and salt. Foraging was often a family effort. Children carried baskets, picking low to the ground, while elders searched along the hedgerows. Once gathered, the greens were boiled into soups, stir-fried with garlic, or eaten raw with a splash of vinegar and a pinch of salt. The flavors could be sharp or bitter, but after weeks of dry bread or thin porridge, even bitterness was welcome. These plants were nature's quiet gift, a reminder that even in the hardest seasons, the land still offered something. And when fortune smiled and the harvest was good, peasants could add one last humble ingredient to their pots, a sweet, filling crop that had only recently arrived from far beyond China's shores. Sweet potatoes were newcomers to China, arriving from across the seas during the Ming dynasty. For poor farming families, they were a blessing that could grow in soils too thin for rice or wheat. Once the vines spread across the fields, they promised a harvest that could carry a household through the leanest months. In peasant kitchens, sweet potatoes were often chopped into rough chunks and boiled together with rice or millet to make a thin congee. The roots softened in the pot, their gentle sweetness seeping into the broth. On days when grain was scarce, more sweet potato was added to stretch the meal, turning a small handful of rice into enough to feed everyone. The bright orange pieces stood out against the pale porridge, a small comfort to tired eyes and hungry stomachs. Children fished them out first, savoring the soft, sweet flesh before tackling the rest of the bowl. It was a dish born of necessity, but remembered with gratitude, for it meant survival in years when the fields gave too little. These 15 meals may seem small and plain today, but together they carried generations of peasants through famine, toil, and the unending work of keeping an empire alive. Now, these humble dishes may seem meager now, but they were the backbone of life for millions. Each bowl, each bite, was a small victory against hunger. If you've enjoyed stepping into their world, give this video a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more untold stories of the past. Which of these meals would you try? Let us know in the comments.